Welcome back to Sahara TV. My name is Rudolph Okonkwo. This is our continuation of our discussion on education in Nigeria. It was triggered by an article written by Dr. Malcolm Fabiyi on Sahara Reporters. Dr. Fabiyi made first class in chemical engineering from the University of Lagos. He got his PhD from the University of Cambridge and a master's degree from the University of Chicago. He is a visiting professor at Lagos Business School. As a student at the University of Lagos, he was also the president of the Student Union Association. So Dr. Malcolm Fabiyi, welcome to Sahara TV. Hello?
Yes.
I say welcome to Sahara TV.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so let me start by asking you, are you aware that yesterday the president signed a budget of $31 billion for 2012? Do you know how much of that budget is dedicated to education in Nigeria?
Typically, the Nigerian educational budget is no more than about 2 to 3% of the budget. And that's sad. If you go back to the 60s and the 70s, the educational budget for Nigeria was typically between 40 to 50% of the federal budget.
Okay, so in your essay, Serving Education in Nigeria, you identified a problem in the Nigerian Constitution. Can you tell us what the problem is?
In Section 18 of the Constitution, that's the section of the Constitution that actually spells out the educational objectives of the Nigerian government. Section 18 of the Nigerian Constitution, and I'm talking about the 1999 Constitution, essentially spells out the educational objectives of the government. And what that section essentially says, and I can essentially quote it verbatim, is it says government shall strive to eradicate illiteracy, and to this end, government shall, as and when practicable, provide Section 18A, free compulsory universal primary education, 18.3b, free secondary education, 18.3c, free university education, and 18.3d, free adult literacy programs. The problem, so this is fantastic. It essentially means that in principle, the Nigerian state and the Nigerian people, through their constitution, believe that education should be free at all levels. The Constitution indicates that it is the duty of the government to ensure that free education occurs at all levels. But this is the problem. The problem is in the clause that says government shall strive to eradicate illiteracy, and to this end, government shall, as and when practicable. Who determines when it is practicable for government to fund education? So that's the problem. It is an affirmative statement. What this section essentially does is to tell us that as Nigerians, it is our right to have free education. But then there's a clause, and it's a very tricky and deliberate clause. It's a clause that says, yes, you can have free education, but we, the government, will determine when it is practicable. When is it practicable? Is it when the government has decided and the people in government have corruptly enriched themselves, and then what is left over is what will be left for education? If indeed this section of the Constitution was operative as it is defined to be, then what it means is that the fluctuations that we keep seeing in educational spending, we should not see that. If indeed the rights of Nigerians to free education as enshrined in the Constitution is followed, then what it means is the level of spending in our educational system should not be at a paltry 2 to 3%. There's a reason why people were spending, 30, 40, 50% on education in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. The needs that we had for education then have not gone any lower. If anything, they've become more intensive, right? The population has increased. There are a lot more Nigerians in school. There are a lot more Nigerians that are young, a lot more Nigerians within school-going age.
Why then is it that even though our constitution guarantees these basic rights, in essence, what has happened is that the educational sector in Nigeria has essentially been starved of funds. And, let's make no mistake about this. The quality problems in Nigerian education are fundamentally caused by a lack of adequate funding in that sector. And if we want to change anything, we might complain about the fact that only, 10% of Nigerian students that take NECO or 10% of Nigerian students that take JAM pass. We may complain about the fact that a Nigerian graduate cannot even write a correct sentence in English. We might complain about the fact that people who graduate and call themselves, I've actually spoken to someone who graduated from a Nigerian university, told me that she had a degree in biz admin and couldn't tell me what biz admin meant. Couldn't tell me that biz admin actually meant business administration. So we have a significant issue. And my fundamental belief is that that issue is driven by the lack of funding. And if we're here relying on government and the goodwill of people in government to fund the educational system, then we are mistaken.
Now, you formed Save Education in Nigeria today as a kind of a movement that hopes to correct this. How many people are members of this Facebook or have joined the movement?
Not very many. Well, we've had quite a bit of interest. I think I was very encouraged by the number of people who had read the article on Sahara Reporters and had immediately, signed up to support the movement. We still don't have the numbers that we need. In order for this to change, again, what we need if this is going to change is essentially a constitutional amendment. And all that we're saying is that, I've read you that section of the Constitution. And all we need to do with this constitutional amendment is to remove those four words that enable government to actually take educational funding as one of these discretionary items whose levels they can determine. So we have some support. That support is by no way sufficient. We think that if we want to get the attention of government at all levels, we definitely need to get the attention of the National Assembly. And if we're to do that, we don't need a few hundred Nigerians signing up. We need thousands. Our goal is to actually get 1 million Nigerians signed up to our petition. 1 million Nigerians talking about the problems in the educational sector. 1 million Nigerians saying that this has to change. And I believe that as a people, we may have issues with political ideologies. We may disagree fundamentally on how the derivation from resources should be shared. We may disagree fundamentally on the rotation of power. We may disagree fundamentally on what government should do about the financial sector. But what I believe all Nigerians can agree on is that if there's one thing that can save our nation, if there's one thing that will ensure that we become that nation that all of us wish and hope for, then the bedrock for that progress and development has to be education. And so what we would like to see is for more Nigerians to go to Sahara Reporters, to read that article, and at the bottom of that article, as you indicated, we formed the group Save Education in Nigeria Today. If they go on Facebook and search for Save Education in Nigeria Today, they will find that website. They will also find a link to an online petition that we have on two websites, on change.org. So if you go to www.change.org and type in Save Education in Nigeria Today, you will find an online petition that we have on change.org. You will also find another version of the online petition at a website called gopetition.com. So it's gopetition.org.
Now, people in government will say that by taking out that part of the Constitution, you are putting them on hook in the sense that even if they don't have money for education, that they are going to be forced to provide that money. What do you say to that?
What I say to that is that's utter rubbish. So, and I say two things. The first thing is it is deliberate. Yes, we want to put government on the hook. And if we put government on the hook for education, is that such a bad thing? Is it wrong for us to tell our government that there are certain things that we believe are essential to the nation? Is it wrong for us to tell our government that what we want in Nigeria is a Nigeria that has an educated citizenry. You were here talking about Boko Haram. What do you think the cause of Boko Haram is? If you go to Kano, and I've done the statistics on this, there are more children out of school in Kano than those that are in school. 75% of the young people in Kano between the ages of 4, and Kano, as you know, obviously the north is the bedrock of Boko Haram. The northeast and portions of the north central, Kaduna, Kano, are right now, the most significant places where the Boko Haram crisis is taking place. Why do you think we're not seeing those types of problems in southern Nigeria? Even though education is in crisis all around the country, one of the issues you will find is that, if Nigeria is hard enough for those who have an education, what do you think the situation is for those who don't have an education? What options do they have? So the bottom line is, I think it is our right as citizens to be able to tell our government that there are certain things that we cannot negotiate away. And at the end of the day, how much are we even talking about in terms of educational funding? The truth of the matter is that the 3 to 4% that they are even allocating to the educational sector, it's not going far enough. But at the end of the day, if we were saying that government should fully fund education, then essentially, if you look globally, countries that give full funding to education, countries like Cuba, they don't have oil, they don't have any natural resources. All that Cuba relies on is mostly agricultural production. How can a country like Cuba actually support its citizens completely, give them free education at all levels? And here we are, supposedly the giant of Africa, a nation that is the 6th largest producer of oil in the world, and tell ourselves what government can actually look us in the face as citizens and tell us that we don't have enough resources to actually fund education in our nation. How can we say we can't fund education when all that we need to do is to go back in our own country to the 50s and 60s when we didn't have oil and when the Western region was actually giving full free education to its citizens at all levels? So I believe that if any government comes up and makes those arguments, that cannot be a serious government. If any government comes up and says they don't have enough funding for education and claim that there are certain priorities that supersede education, then what I would say to that government is that is a government that doesn't have its priorities right.
Now, I want to ask you about, you mentioned Kano. I don't know if you've studied how the school system in Kano works in terms of, do they have free education at the primary and secondary school level, or don't they? And is it really a question of funding? That's what your critics will say at some level, especially in the North. Is it a question of funding or a question of motivation? What is the problem?
Okay, so there are two problems, and I'm grateful to you for raising this issue. I don't think any of us will argue with the fact that there's a funding problem. All you need to do to understand there's a funding problem is to go to our schools, to our public schools. I mean, I'm a product of the Nigerian public school system. Any Nigerian that is 30 years and above will know what I'm talking about. Nigerians that are lower than 30 years in age, when we talk about a solid quality public school system, they will wonder what it is you're talking about, because their experience, the experience of any Nigerian that's less than 30 years old, is one in which the public school system is the educational system that people who do not have the means go to. Anybody within our generation, Rudolph, must have been to public schools. I'm a product of the public school system. I'm a product of a public school system that was decently funded, perhaps not as well funded as it should have been, but the things we thought were bad then are even worse now. So to go to your specific question about Kano, this is the tragedy in Nigeria today. Because of the federal structure that we have, primary school education is in the hands of local government. Secondary school education is supposed to be administered by state governments. Tertiary education is administered by the federal government. Now, obviously, state governments can make the choice, if they want to also get involved in tertiary education. So every state in Nigeria has its own state university. But constitutionally, and this is enabled by the Universal Basic Education Act and the formation of the Universal Basic Education Commission in 1999. So essentially, but this is a tragedy. You and I know that when funds are allocated to state government to be shared and distributed to local government, before those funds get to the local government, the state governor sits down and takes his own share, quote and unquote, of the funds. Those funds that are going to local government over 80% of those funds are intended to be funds that do two things. One is a lot of those funds are supposed to go towards education, and the other portion of the funds are supposed to go towards the healthcare system. Because those are the two major things that constitutionally the government essentially covers. So we put primary school education, the most fundamental part of our educational system, in the hands of people who have no value for education. How many people can hold local government chairmen accountable for how they spend money? So if you actually go to the local government level, where primary education is administered in Nigeria, you will weep. You will see classrooms that have no shutters. You will see teachers who can't speak English. And again, that goes to the funding issue. So one part of it is the funding right now is limited, but how do we administer the funding? What checks and balances are in place to ensure that the amounts of money is going out for education are actually spent on education? So if you ask me, I do not know how a local government chairman who himself didn't go to school, I mean, all you need to be in Nigeria to be a local government chairman is essentially to have the equivalent of a GCE school certificate, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know how people who themselves don't value education can be expected to administer education. The second problem is at the state level where secondary schools are supposed to be administered. You and I know, so if we're sitting here saying that Ibori took away close to $1 billion of naira from the Delta state government, where do you think those funds have come from? Definitely when allocations were being made to Delta state, a lot of those funds were supposed to go to, some crucial, serious areas. Some were supposed to go to infrastructural development. Some were supposed to go to the healthcare system. Some were supposed to go to education. So every time we hear that Bankole has gone away with 30 billion naira, every time we hear that Ibori has absconded with hundreds of millions of dollars, those are funds. The portion of those funds, without doubt, are funds that are intended for the educational system. So that's a fundamental issue. The fundamental issue we have is the system is not adequately funded, but even the funds that are sent into the system, there is no way right now in the country where we can have checks and balances that enable us to understand or determine where these funds are going to. And then this is the other tragedy. Primary school education, for instance, is in the hands of local governments. But we do not have a structure that allows us to punish local governments that don't fund education. So, for example, if a local government chairman decides that he will never pay or put any investment into the educational system, I'm sorry, but anybody in that local government has stuck with that guy for 4 years. And they may be stuck with him forever. With the political system that we have, the fact that this man hasn't funded education doesn't mean he's going to be voted out of office 4 years after.
Now, let me stop you. Let me stop you there, because I think what I'm getting from you is that you're talking about about control of education system and also reforms. Well, I don't know if you're aware that in 2007 there was this new act called the Education Reform Act that was passed, and it was supported by the World Bank and all the international groups that are interested in education. And the emphasis was towards privatization and commercialization of education in Nigeria. So how do you feel that what you are proposing is more like going counter to what where the people who are stakeholders in education seem to be going at this moment?
Okay, so I think this is one thing we should fundamentally understand. If you say education in Nigeria, and if you say one of the ways, so what that Reform Act essentially is saying is that the government is throwing up his arms, and the government is essentially saying, if we want growth in the educational sector, we must find a way of involving the private sector. I have absolutely no issues with that. There's no reason why the private sector should not be involved in education. In fact, because of the failures of government, if you want a quality education in Nigeria today, the only place you likely should go to is the private sector. But the fact that we're calling for increased funding doesn't mean that somehow the private sector should actually have reduced, that somehow it goes against this Reform Act. So let me give you an example. If the Constitution is telling us that every single Nigerian child, and in fact in Section 18.3d, because that section also indicates that free adult educational programs, adult literacy programs are to be covered by the government, it essentially means any Nigerian who is interested in education has a right to funds that are provided by the government. Now, the amendment we're talking about doesn't talk about how those funds should be allocated. But I don't see any reason why a Nigerian child that wants to go to a private school cannot get a certain amount of money that is due to them under this constitutional act that they can deploy towards public school or towards a private school. So essentially what I'm saying is, if we do this correctly, any rational government should just determine how many Nigerian children are out there that are supposed to be in the primary school system or in the secondary school system or in the tertiary school system. And the way you develop a budget is that you allocate a certain amount of money per child. If that child chooses the public school system, fine. If they choose the private school system, fine. So what we're proposing should actually strengthen. So again, I realize that what we're saying right now does not talk about how these funds are allocated. We have to choose our battles. The first battle is let's fund education adequately. The next battle should be, now that we've funded education adequately, let us ensure that those funds go in the right places. And let us ensure that the private school system that have stepped in the gap to make up for the issues we have in the public school system do not suffer for the fact that they've actually come in and to get involved in this entire area. So in my view, what we're proposing in many ways is actually complementary to any reform programs that are currently in place in the country.
Okay. Let me know. I know that you know about these statistics. That Nigerian students spend about 246 billion in the United Kingdom. In Ghana, they spend about 155 billion every year in education. The same thing in the United States. So with this money going out of the country, how is that impacting the education that we have at home? And the fact that most of the children of important Nigerians are schooling abroad.
Well, so this is the. I think those are very sad statistics. You and I, Rudolph, went to school in Nigeria at a time where even if you had options overseas, the quality of education you got in Nigeria was excellent. And we cannot, so it's a shame that we've got into a stage where if you really want a quality education, unfortunately today you must leave Nigeria, if we're talking about tertiary education. Is it not sad that the child of the Minister of State for Education, Barrister Fabiyi, his own daughter is actually in Ghana. Practically everyone that determines educational policy in Nigeria doesn't have a child in the Nigerian educational system. When you and I were in school, when I was in school, in the same classroom that I was in, I had the children of two past heads of state. This was a public school. The children of two past heads of state were in the same school as I was. The children of Nigerian ministers and Inspector General of Police was in the same school as I was. Why would they not have been interested in the Nigerian educational system? Since their own children are involved. Since their own children are receiving the same instruction that the children of poor Nigerians are receiving. So part of the problem that we have, I think, is that what has happened is we've essentially, there are two Nigerias. There's a Nigeria that the common man lives in. A Nigeria that he has no options to opt out of. And then there's the Nigeria of the rich, the powerful, the mighty, and the politically connected. And unfortunately, 20, 30 years ago, regardless of what your father or mother's economic class was, all Nigerians actually interacted within the classroom. You could walk into a classroom and you would find the child of the woman who was frying akara. You would find the child of the man who is the military governor of the state. And you would also find the child of the person who is the director of a bank. That Nigeria is gone. Why are we seeing people leave the Nigerian educational system? I put it to you, Rudolph, that if the people that are responsible for educational funding in Nigeria are comfortable with having their children continue to move out of the country, then I'm sorry to say that there's nothing that's going to reverse that trend. All those monies, so I think your question was, if those monies were put into Nigeria, if those monies didn't, weren't being moved out of the country to places like Ghana, to places like South Africa, to places like the US, to places like the UK, could that money be used to to help to fund the educational system in Nigeria? The answer is yes. But why would you, if people have the means to run away from the mess and morass that we have in the educational sector in Nigeria, you can't hold them. I mean, the only people that I would say are behaving in a morally reprehensible manner by allowing their children to get out of the system are those that are political leaders. Because, it has to be hypocritical. You cannot be a political leader in Nigeria. You can't be a governor. You can't be a local government chairman. You shouldn't be a state governor. You shouldn't be a senator. You shouldn't be a House of Reps member coming up every day to tell us nonsense about how you care about education. And then the same educational system you're talking about, none of your children and none of those around you are participating in it. So those monies are leaving. I think what it tells you is that Nigerians are hungry for good education. But quite frankly, I don't know that there's anything we can do about it. I think it's really symptomatic of the problems that we have.
Okay, Dr. Malcolm Fabiyi, thank you for coming on the show, and I wish you luck in getting the signatures you need and pushing for this change.
Thank you very much. And so I would again just implore your listeners to get on Sahara Reporters. Find that article titled "Save Education in Nigeria." Today, they can go on Facebook. They will find that we have a website, a Facebook site. They should go to change.org and go to gopetitions.com and support us and tell their friends in Nigeria and around the world that if Nigerian educational system is going to change, it has to begin with us.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Yeah. That was Dr. Malcolm Fabiyi talking about the effort to save education in Nigeria, and we hope you will join in that effort.